The first time whiskey shows up in the historical record, it's a death notice, and I mean that literally. The very first written reference to distilled grain spirit in Irish history comes from a medieval chronicle called the Annals of Clonmacnoise, dated to the year 1405. The entry is short. It records the death of a chieftain, a man named Richard McGrannell, attributed to a surfeit of Aqua Vitae, the water of life. Someone sat down at a scriptorium that Christmas and decided that detail was worth preserving. The first time whiskey appears in the historical record, it has already killed someone. You clicked on a video about how America's most dangerous drink was born, which tells me you probably already sense there's more to this than bourbon barrels and frontier mythology. There is, a lot more. There's something like a 1,000-year argument about what this substance actually is. Medicine or poison, currency or criminal enterprise, cultural heritage or public health emergency. And here's the thing, depending on which century you're looking at and who's doing the asking, the answer turns out to be all of those things at once. What this video traces is the full arc, from a medieval monastery still to a Scots-Irish farmstead in western Pennsylvania. From the Whiskey Rebellion, which produced the only moment in American history when a sitting president personally led an army into the field against his own citizens, to a quality crisis so severe that the commercial slang for what was being sold included coffin varnish and sudden death. From what became one of the first federal consumer protection laws in American history, written essentially to stop people from putting iodine and tobacco juice in a bottle and calling it bourbon, through Prohibition and its extraordinary medicinal loophole, and all the way to a scientific consensus that is more direct and more uncomfortable than the heritage marketing would ever let on. By the time we're done, you won't just know what bourbon is or where it came from. You'll understand why the history of American whiskey and the history of America are, chapter by chapter, essentially the same story. The same conflicts, the same tensions, the same argument about who gets to make the rules and who has to live under them. If you're the kind of person who finds it interesting that the very first mention of whiskey in the historical record is basically a medieval coroner's note, and that things only got stranger from there, this channel is pretty much made for you. Food history, culinary archaeology, the specific and sometimes absurd human stories behind what people ate and drank and occasionally banned. That's what we do here. Subscribing keeps you in the loop. And tell me in the comments, which corner of this history is pulling you most? The political drama, the fraud, the chemistry, the medicine? I really want to know. Before whiskey was American, before it was Irish or Scottish, before it carried any national identity at all, it was a technique, a process. And the people who developed it were not farmers or traders or frontier distillers. They were monks. The principle of distillation, heat a liquid, capture the vapor, cool it, collect the concentrated result, is extraordinarily old. We're talking ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, the alchemical traditions of the ancient Near East. The technical knowledge of how this works stretches back centuries before anyone thought to apply it to a fermented grain mash. But the specific application of distillation to produce something we'd recognize today as a spirit developed gradually through the early medieval period, and it developed in a setting that might surprise you. The European monastery. Monasteries in medieval Europe were, essentially the most sophisticated technical institutions in the Western world at that time. They had literate record keepers. They had continuity across generations. The monastery outlived its individual members, which meant knowledge accumulated over decades and centuries in ways it simply couldn't in a family or a single village. They had economic resources sufficient to sustain multi-year experimentation. And they had a specific, formally recognized purpose that made distillation not merely permissible, but medically necessary, producing medicinal preparations for the communities they served. The still, in its earliest form, was not some commercial apparatus for producing recreational spirits. It was a medical instrument, a device for concentrating the healing properties of botanical materials, herbs, roots, and resins into a smaller, more potent, and more portable form. Now here's something that should scramble any tidy nationalist narrative about whiskey's origins. The knowledge of how to build and operate an effective still did not spontaneously appear in Celtic monasteries. Scholars who study this transmission generally think it travelled through Islamic scientific networks, through the Arabic, alchemical and pharmaceutical traditions of the early medieval period, before reaching the Irish and Scottish monks, who then adapted it to local grain mashes. Right? The drink that would become the defining spirit of American frontier culture, with its deeply Protestant Scots-Irish heritage, got to those Celtic monasteries through Muslim scholarship. History has a way of confounding the tidy stories we try to build around things. The product of this early monastic distillation was called Aqua Vitae, Latin for the water of life. In Irish, it became Uisce Beartha. Same two words, same meaning. And the anglicisation of Uisce is where the English language eventually got the word whiskey. That etymology is not just trivia, it tells you something precise about how this substance was understood by the first people who made it. It was medicine, not something you poured on a Tuesday evening. The two earliest documentary records of distilled grain spirit in the British Isles are separated by around 89 years. The first is that Annals of Clonmacnoise entry from 1405, the chieftain's death at Christmas, originally written in Gaelic, though we now rely on a 17th century English translation for the specifics. The second is the Exchequer Rolls of Scotland, 1494, recording malt provided to Friar John Core, by most scholarly accounts a Dominican friar serving in the royal household, by order of King James IV, wherewith to make Aqua Vitae. Note the precision of that second document. This is not a casual margin note. This is a government account book recording an institutional transaction. Friar John Core is receiving malt in officially recorded quantity to make a specific product. The quantities involved: 8 bowls of malt, enough to produce hundreds of bottles of spirit by most estimates, suggest that distillation was already well established in Scotland, not some tentative experiment. The Scots were producing this at volumes worth formally tracking at the national administrative level. What they were making bears very little resemblance to what we'd recognise as whiskey today. It was unaged, drawn straight from the still, clear, harsh, without any of the complexity that comes from extended contact with oak. The amber colour, the vanilla and caramel notes, the particular mellowness of a properly aged spirit, all of that is wood's contribution. And the discovery that wood improved the spirit was not some intentional design decision. Distillers stored product in wooden barrels because wooden barrels were the standard container of the age. They noticed, gradually and empirically, that spirit left in oak became something different, something better. That observation, that time in wood was a feature rather than a logistical inconvenience, would eventually become one of the foundational principles of every major whiskey tradition in the world. But first, the technique had to cross an ocean. By the late 1600s, distillation had moved from the monastery to the farm, and from the physician's dispensary into the commercial marketplace. And it was about to travel with a very specific group of people to a very specific part of the American continent. And understanding why it travelled with them tells you almost everything about what American whiskey would become. The demographic group that shaped American whiskey culture more than any other carries a name that needs a moment of unpacking. The Scots-Irish were not ethnically half Scottish and half Irish in some blended sense. They were descendants of Scottish Presbyterians who had been deliberately resettled in Ulster, in the north of Ireland, during the 17th century plantation of Ulster, a British colonial project that moved Protestant Scots onto Irish land as a mechanism of political and religious control. These communities spent a generation or two in Ulster, found themselves economically squeezed and religiously marginalised, and emigrated again, this time to North America, arriving in substantial numbers throughout the 18th century. They settled disproportionately in the places that would become the engine of American whiskey production: the western frontiers of Pennsylvania, Virginia, and the Carolinas, and later Kentucky and Tennessee. They brought two things with them that mattered enormously. 1. The practical, working knowledge of distillation rooted in the pot-still traditions of both Scotland and Ireland. 2. A cultural familiarity with whisky as a household staple, not a luxury, not an occasional indulgence, just an ordinary part of agricultural life. Both of those things proved decisive. The economic logic of distillation on the American frontier was almost brutally simple, and understanding it explains why whisky became so deeply embedded so quickly. Grain was very heavy to transport. Roads in colonial America were, let's say, not great, and for long stretches between frontier settlements essentially non-existent. The cost of transporting agricultural goods to distant markets were frequently prohibitive. The frontier economy also had a chronic shortage of hard currency. Coins were scarce, the colonial banking infrastructure was minimal, and reliable credit arrangements were largely absent on the frontier. A farmer with surplus rye grain faced a genuine pressing problem. How do you convert that grain into something tradable, portable, and durable enough to actually reach a market? The still answered that question efficiently. Distill your surplus rye into whiskey, and you've transformed several heavy, perishable bushels of grain into a smaller volume of something that never spoils, travels reasonably well, and is accepted as payment for practically anything. Archival records from the period document that whisky functioned as literal currency in frontier communities, used to pay labour, settle debts, conduct trade, and compensate professionals in regions with no reliable monetary supply. The whisky barrel was the frontier farmer's bank account. The still was a financial instrument. Rye became the dominant grain in the mid-Atlantic colonies, Pennsylvania, Maryland, New York, not because anyone preferred its flavour, but because rye was what grew in those soils and climates. The whisky followed the agricultural reality. Meanwhile, rum, distilled from Caribbean molasses, remained the dominant commercial spirit through much of the colonial period. That balance shifted after the Revolution, when disrupted trade with the British Caribbean cut off the molasses supply and elevated the importance of domestically produced grain spirits. So the conditions for a domestic whisky industry were falling into place, economically, agriculturally, demographically. Whisky was also woven into the social fabric of colonial and frontier life in ways that went well beyond economics. It appeared at harvests and barn raisings, provided as standard compensation for communal labour. It showed up at political gatherings, religious meetings and elections. It was served in taverns, which functioned as the civic centres of colonial communities. It was not, in this period, regarded as a problem requiring legislative attention. The temperance critique of whisky as a moral evil was still decades away, and it would emerge precisely because whisky's social centrality was so total, so normalised, so completely embedded in the daily fabric of these communities. You can't mount a moral crusade against something unless it's already everywhere, and the quality of what was being made varied enormously. Without standardized production methods, consistent raw materials, or any systematic aging practice, the whisky produced by hundreds of small farm distilleries ranged from reasonably palatable to genuinely hazardous. This problem, the problem of adulteration, inconsistent quality, and misrepresentation, did not originate in the 19th century. It started here in the colonial period, and it ran forward continuously into every regulatory conflict that followed. Then the new federal government looked at all of this economic activity, totaled up the numbers, and decided whisky looked like a reasonable place to find some revenue. The new federal government was in serious fiscal trouble after the revolution. It needed revenue urgently, and it decided to go looking for it among people who had very strong feelings about the relationship between taxation and political representation. In 1791, Alexander Hamilton, Treasury Secretary under President George Washington, introduced the first federal excise tax on distilled spirits. The fiscal rationale was explicit and urgent. The new national government had inherited enormous accumulated debt from the Revolutionary War, including the debts of individual states that Hamilton's financial plan committed the federal government to absorb. To service that debt, Hamilton proposed excise taxes on domestic goods, and distilled spirits topped the list. Here's the thing about how the tax was structured. It was graduated in a way that became immediately and bitterly significant. Large commercial distillers paid a lower effective rate per gallon, roughly 6 cents. Small farm pot still operators in the frontier regions paid proportionally more, around 9 cents per gallon. Whether this structure was deliberate policy calculation or incidental byproduct of how the system worked, the men it disadvantaged most did not miss the implication. And the grievance went deeper than just the money. Many of the farmers resisting this tax were veterans of the Revolutionary War, men who had spent years fighting against what they understood as unjust taxation imposed by a distant government without their meaningful consent. The parallel to taxation without representation was not, for these communities, some rhetorical device for a pamphlet. These men framed their opposition in explicitly revolutionary terms. Scholars examining the political language of the resistance have documented that many of them understood themselves to be fighting for the same principles in opposing the whiskey tax as they had in opposing British imperial taxation. I mean, they had just bled for those principles. The idea that the new government would immediately replicate the exact fiscal relationship they'd gone to war to escape was not a theoretical problem. It felt like betrayal. It felt like betrayal. Federal tax collectors sent to register stills and collect payments were not received warmly. Tax collectors were tarred and feathered. Property was destroyed. Lives were threatened. Between 1792 and 1794, resistance in western Pennsylvania escalated from scattered non-compliance to organized insurrection with defined leadership and coordinated action. The crisis peaked in July of 1794. On July 16th, a force of around 500 to 600 armed men, commanded by Major James McFarlane, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, surrounded the estate of General John Neville, who served as the regional federal tax inspector. Neville had escaped before the main confrontation, but his home, known as Bower Hill, near present-day Bridgeville, Pennsylvania, became the flashpoint. The previous day a smaller group had been repulsed. This day's assault was larger and more organized. A firefight lasted about an hour. McFarlane was killed when he stepped into the open during what appeared to be a ceasefire. The enraged rebels burned Bower Hill to the ground. Washington's response was unprecedented. He issued a proclamation on August 7th identifying the frontier violence as treasonous acts amounting to levying war against the United States, and mobilized nearly 13,000 federalized militiamen drawn from 4 states under the authority the Constitution had granted the federal government. And then, this is the only time this has ever happened in American history. A sitting president personally led those forces into the field. Washington accompanied the army himself as far as Bedford, Pennsylvania, before turning command over to General Henry Lee. The proportion is worth sitting with for a moment. Nearly 13,000 soldiers dispatched to suppress a rebel force estimated in the hundreds. The tactical situation did not require that number. The political message did. The rebels dispersed before the army arrived. No significant battle occurred. Several leaders were arrested, tried for treason, and subsequently pardoned by Washington, a calibrated sequence that said clearly, "The law exists. It will be enforced, and mercy is available to those who acknowledge its authority." The rebellion had 2 lasting consequences for whiskey history. First, it established definitively that the federal government would tax distilled spirits, a fiscal reality that has run unbroken from 1791 to the present day. Second, it accelerated a specific westward migration. Many of the most resistant Scots-Irish farmers of western Pennsylvania moved west, some directly because of the rebellion, others simply following economic opportunity beyond the effective reach of the federal revenue apparatus. They went to Kentucky, they went to Tennessee. They carried their pot stills and their recipes with them. And in Kentucky, they found a geological and agricultural environment that turned out to be almost uniquely suited to making a particular kind of whiskey. Kentucky had something that the soils of western Pennsylvania did not, something underground, something to do with how the water moved through the rock, and it mattered enormously to what ended up in the bottle. The advantages Kentucky offered for whiskey production are not mythology, they're geological and measurable. Limestone formations underlying much of the Kentucky landscape filter groundwater in a specific and consequential way. They strip out iron compounds that interfere with fermentation and leave behind a mineral profile calcium-rich, magnesium-containing, iron-poor, that is beneficial to yeast activity and to the character of the finished spirit. Distillers working in Kentucky recognized this empirically long before modern analytical chemistry could explain the mechanism. They knew the water was better. They were right. The grain that grew most productively in the fertile soils of the Kentucky bluegrass region was corn, specifically maize. Corn produced a sweeter, fuller spirit than rye. It was abundantly productive in those conditions, making it the natural agricultural choice. The convergence of limestone-filtered water, a climate favourable to corn, and a population of skilled distillers arriving with generations of accumulated knowledge created something that had not existed before, a regionally specific, geographically advantaged centre of whisky production with distinct and reproducible characteristics. The particular practice that came to define Kentucky bourbon, aging new-make corn spirit in charred oak barrels, appears to have developed gradually rather than as any single person's invention. Elijah Craig, a Baptist minister who opened a distillery in Georgetown, Kentucky in 1789, is often credited as the inventor of bourbon. The historical literature is honest about this. The attribution is not supported by unambiguous documentary evidence, and the charring of barrels almost certainly developed in multiple locations over time, rather than originating in one discrete moment of inspiration. What is documentarily certain is more interesting anyway. The first known advertisement using the word bourbon to describe a whiskey appeared on May 1st, 1821, in a Paris, Kentucky newspaper called the Western Citizen. The firm placing the ad was Stout and Adams out of Maysville, offering bourbon whiskey by the barrel or keg. Not Lexington, not Louisville. A newspaper called the Western Citizen in a town named Paris, in a county named after French royalty as a gesture of Revolutionary-era gratitude for French military assistance, advertising a distinctly American spirit. If you were designing American history for maximum irony, you'd struggle to beat that. By 1840, bourbon was a commercially recognized and commonly used category name in advertising and correspondence. By 1964, Congress would formally designate it a distinct product of the United States. But we'll get there. The chemistry of what the charred barrel actually does to the whiskey was not understood in the 1820s. It is understood now in considerable detail. The charring creates two functional layers at the surface of the oak stave. The outer layer is essentially charcoal, which filters sulfur compounds and other harsh elements out of the new spirit. Beneath it is a layer of caramelized wood sugars that migrate gradually into the whiskey during aging, contributing the characteristic vanilla, caramel, and toffee notes people associate with mature bourbon. The wood's tannins add structure. Its lactones contribute a softer, rounder complexity. All of this happens through years of seasonal contact, the whiskey expanding into the wood during summer heat and contracting back in winter cold, extracting different compounds at different temperatures. Time is an active ingredient. Federal standards require that bourbon's grain bill contain a minimum of 51% corn. Most commercial producers use considerably more, often 65 to 80%, supplemented with rye or wheat for flavor complexity, and malted barley to supply the enzymes that convert starches into fermentable sugars. The yeast strains used in fermentation are among the most closely guarded assets in the industry, because different yeasts produce different congener profiles, the mixture of flavor compounds beyond ethanol that give each distillery's whiskey its distinctive character. The choice between pot stills and column stills also matters significantly. Column stills produce higher proof, lighter spirit more efficiently. Pot stills retain more congeners and produce a more complex, smaller volume output. This tension between the efficiency of column distillation and the character of pot still spirit became central to the whiskey definition debates of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Worth noting briefly, Tennessee whiskey developed its own distinct practice alongside Kentucky bourbon. The Lincoln County process, filtering new-make whiskey through layers of sugar maple charcoal before barrel aging, distinguishes Tennessee whiskey from Kentucky bourbon and represents a parallel development, and became the defining technical characteristic of what would later be codified as a separate product category. Distilleries in Tennessee, and eventually brands like Jack Daniel's, represented a parallel thread of American whiskey development rooted in the same Scots-Irish distilling culture and corn-based traditions as Kentucky bourbon, just with one additional step in the process. Back in Kentucky, the commercial system by which bourbon reached consumers in the mid-19th century was, without anyone quite intending it, creating the conditions for a serious crisis. Distillers sold aged whiskey to retailers in whole barrels. What happened inside those barrels after they changed hands was entirely unregulated. And what happened, in a significant number of cases, was not good at all. There is a specific category of person in 19th century whiskey commerce whose professional title sounds almost technical and respectable. The title is Rectifier. Almost nothing about what rectifiers actually did was respectable. A rectifier in the 19th century American whiskey trade was an intermediary. The functional description is this: a rectifier bought bulk spirits, typically raw, unaged, neutral grain alcohol, produced cheaply and quickly, and then dressed them up through blending, colouring and flavouring into products sold under labels claiming they were aged bourbon or straight rye. The word rectifier has connotations of precision and refinement. The actual practice had neither. The substances that rectifiers added to simulate the appearance and character of aged whiskey are documented in period accounts, and they are remarkable in their range and their potential for harm. Burnt sugar and tobacco juice approximated the amber colour that barrel aging imparts. Chemical dyes were used. Prune juice was added to suggest fruity complexity. Iodine appeared in some formulations to fake the bite of barrel-aged spirit. In more extreme cases, and this is where it moves from fraud into something that could kill people, lead compounds and various industrial chemicals entered the mixture. The commercial slang that attached itself to these products was not colourful exaggeration, it was description. Rot gut, 40 rod, coffin varnish, sudden death. These names appear in period newspapers and in the historical literature of the era. They reflected what people actually experienced when they bought something labelled as whiskey and discovered it contained things whiskey should never contain. By the 1880s and 90s, a substantial proportion of all whiskey sold in the United States consisted of rectified neutral spirit rather than anything you'd actually call straight aged whiskey. The legitimate distillers, producers who had invested years and capital in actually aging actual grain in actual charred oak barrels, against rectifiers who produced a cheaper imitation and faced no legal consequence whatsoever, found themselves at a direct commercial disadvantage. Period accounts describe its competitive tactics as including outright violence against producers who refused to join its cartel arrangements. So the honest producers were caught in a structure with no good exits. Below them, rectifiers undercut the market with fraudulent product that consumers could not distinguish from the genuine article. Above them, a monopoly controlled the commercial infrastructure. Between those pressures, the honest distillers made a pragmatic decision. They would bring the federal government in as an ally, use a government quality guarantee to restore the consumer trust the rectifier era had systematically destroyed, and use the market itself to punish fraudulent production. What followed is one of the more surprising turns in American regulatory history. Because the first significant federal consumer protection law in the United States was not driven by public health advocates or moral reformers, it was driven by bourbon distillers who were, basically, fed up with being undercut by people selling industrial chemicals in whiskey bottles. The Bottled in Bond Act of 1897 is recognized by multiple institutional and scholarly sources as among the first federal consumer protection laws in American history. The political energy behind it came primarily from legitimate distillers, most prominently Colonel E. H. Taylor Jr., a Kentucky producer, who had concluded that the only reliable remedy for the rectifier problem was a federal quality guarantee that consumers could verify at a glance without having to trust anything a retailer told them. The Act's requirements were precise in ways that made their precision do real work. A bottled in bond spirit had to be the product of a single distiller at a single distillery during a single distilling season, no blending across different seasons or different facilities. Nothing could be added except pure water, to adjust proof. The whiskey had to be aged for a minimum of 4 years in a federally bonded warehouse, a government-supervised facility where the product was under official oversight from distillation through bottling, providing a chain of custody that no rectifier could falsify. It had to be bottled at exactly 100 proof. The label was required to identify the distillery of origin and, if different, the bottling location. And each bottle was sealed with a distinctive green government tax stamp. That green stamp did more commercial work than any marketing campaign could have. A consumer looking at a bottle bearing the government seal did not need to assess the distiller's reputation or evaluate the retailer's honesty. They had the word of the federal government that what was in the bottle was what it said it was. One producer, one season, no artificial additions, 4 minimum years under government observation. In a market characterized by pervasive fraud and actual public harm for decades, this was a new thing. It converted a question of consumer trust into a question of government accountability. And here's the alignment that actually got the act passed. It solved the federal government's own problem simultaneously. Bonded warehouses gave the government precise accounting of all taxable spirit in storage, while distillers received the right to defer excise tax payment until aging was complete, a real cash flow benefit for producers who would otherwise pay tax on a product they couldn't yet sell. The government's interest in accurate tax collection and the consumer's interest in authentic product were structurally identical in this system. That alignment is more responsible for the Act's passage than any moral argument could have been. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, signed by President Theodore Roosevelt on June 30th, extended consumer protection across the entire American food and drug supply, requiring accurate labeling and prohibiting the sale of adulterated and misbranded goods in interstate commerce. After more than 25 years of legislative proposals, counter-proposals, and failures, it passed. The whiskey adulteration crisis was one of several food safety catastrophes that collectively pushed it through. The subsequent Taft decision of 1909 formally established legal categories for whiskey: straight whiskey, blended whiskey, and imitation whiskey, and required accurate labeling for each. The commercial effect of being required to label your product imitation whiskey was obvious to everyone in the industry. The market incentive for honest production was, for the first time, structural, rather than merely ethical. The regulatory architecture continued developing. In 1938, the federal government formalized the requirement that bourbon be aged in new charred oak containers, codifying a practice that had been characteristic of Kentucky production for over a century, but now making it a federal legal standard. These standards, maintained today by the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, represent the accumulated outcome of more than 2 centuries of regulatory development, legislative action, and commercial pressure. Tennessee added its own layer in 2013, when the state enacted legislation formally codifying the Lincoln County process as a production requirement for spirits sold under that designation. A state-level action reflecting the ongoing tension between regional identity and federal regulatory uniformity. The contemporary craft distilling movement, which grew from dozens of small independent producers in the early 2000s to thousands by the mid-2010s, has generated further regulatory questions, producers experimenting with heritage grains, alternative aging vessels, and localized practices testing the boundaries of existing categories, and pushing ongoing conversations about balancing definitional rigor against room for innovation. The regulatory framework was being built. The quality crisis was being addressed. And then a force arrived that had been organizing for nearly a century, was not interested in the finer points of excise tax accounting or label categories, and was about to shut the entire conversation down for 13 years. The temperance movement's roots in the United States go back at least to the 1830s. Its early form was moral and religious. Protestant evangelical Christianity, voluntary abstinence pledges, systematic documentation of alcohol's social costs, domestic violence, poverty, industrial accidents, crime. Organizations like the American Temperance Society, founded in 1826, and later the Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded in 1874, built substantial memberships by accumulating evidence of alcohol's damage. The Anti-Saloon League, founded in 1893, proved the most organisationally sophisticated, deploying systematic legislative lobbying at state and federal levels with a discipline that reshaped American politics. State-level prohibition laws, beginning with Maine in 1851, demonstrated that total prohibition was politically achievable in specific contexts, and by the early 20th century, a substantial portion of the United States population already lived in localities that had enacted some form of prohibition. The road to federal constitutional prohibition was ultimately unlocked by the First World War. Wartime arguments for prohibition were multiple and mutually reinforcing. Grain used in distillation could go to food production. Alcohol supposedly reduced industrial efficiency in military fitness, and the German-American brewing and distilling industry became a convenient target of the wartime anti-German sentiment running through American public life. This sentiment was widespread. The 18th Amendment passed Congress in 1918. Ratification was certified on January 16, 1919. It took effect exactly 1 year later. The Volstead Act, passed in October 1919, set the legal threshold for intoxicating liquor at 0.5% alcohol by volume, effectively prohibiting all commercially produced beer, wine, and distilled spirits, with one notable exception. Medicinal whiskey continued to be produced and distributed throughout all 13 years of prohibition. Under the relevant provisions of the Volstead Act, several distilleries received government permits to continue operating for medicinal purposes. Licensed physicians could prescribe whiskey. Licensed pharmacies could fill those prescriptions, and the conditions that whiskey was prescribed to treat during prohibition ranged from the plausible, digestive complaints, nervous exhaustion, and to the medically dubious, swollen joints, whooping cough, to the effectively fictional medical conditions. Physicians reportedly wrote something in the range of 11 million whiskey prescriptions during the Prohibition years. People could simply go to their doctor, report some mild ailment, and receive a pint of spirits valid for a 10-day period. Both distilleries and individual drinkers used the medicinal framework to access alcohol for what was, in most practical instances, recreational consumption dressed in pharmaceutical language. Distilleries that had obtained government medicinal permits continued to hold and distribute aged whiskey stocks throughout the entire period, maintaining inventories that proved commercially critical when Repeal came. The rest of the whiskey supply during those 13 years came from bootleggers operating outside any regulatory framework whatsoever. And here's the kicker. The history of the Rectifier era returned in its ugliest form. Illicit spirits were frequently poor quality, produced in unsupervised conditions, and sometimes derived from denatured industrial alcohol, ethanol, that federal policy required to be poisoned with toxic additives specifically to prevent its consumption. When bootleggers tried to neutralize those additives through redistillation and the process was incomplete, people died and sustained permanent injuries throughout the country. The consumer protection architecture that the Bottled-in-Bond Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act had so carefully constructed was, for 13 years, simply absent. The Coffin Varnish era had come back, with no green government stamp in sight. Prohibition ended with the ratification of the 21st Amendment on December 5, 1933, the only constitutional amendment in American history to be repealed by a subsequent amendment. Repeal was driven by organized political opposition. The economic pressure of the Depression made the lost tax revenues from legal alcohol acutely visible to a government that desperately needed them to fund its recovery, and a widespread public assessment that the policy had failed on its own terms. The industry that came back through the door was profoundly damaged. Infrastructure had deteriorated or been demolished across 13 years. Skilled distillers had dispersed and moved on to other trades. Aged whiskey stocks had been consumed, seized, or lost. A distillery reopening in 1933 would not have properly aged 4-year-old bourbon available for sale until 1937 at the earliest. The waiting room was the Great Depression, a time of profound national hardship, and before the first recovery was even complete, The Second World War arrived, and the federal government again redirected distillery capacity to the production of industrial alcohol for the war effort. The American whiskey industry effectively spent the better part of 3 decades in conditions of either active prohibition, wartime constraint, or Depression-era economic pressure, with only brief windows of normal operation between. And then, finally, after all of that, the rebellion, the fraud, the constitutional ban, the war, a sustained recovery arrived. And when it did, it produced something that nobody standing in western Pennsylvania in 1794, watching a tax collector's house burn, could possibly have imagined. An act of Congress declaring American whiskey a matter of national identity. By the late 1940s, the disruptions were finally over. The post-war American economy was expanding at a pace and scale without recent historical precedent. Consumer purchasing power was rising. Demand for premium goods was growing. Changes to tax laws allowed distillers to bring much older whiskies to market than had previously been commercially viable. New brands launched. Distilleries that had maintained continuity through the difficult decades. Jim Beam, tracing its lineage back to Jacob Beam's 18th century distilling operations. Jack Daniel's in Tennessee expanded their operations and extended their reach into markets that now, finally, had money to spend. The cultural positioning of bourbon in this period is worth a moment. In the 1930s, 40s and 50s, whiskey-based cocktails, the old-fashioned, the Manhattan, the whiskey sour, acquired a certain refined mid-century sophistication. Bourbon became associated in the popular imagination with a particular kind of American professional culture, polished, masculine, tied to the advertising and entertainment worlds. This was a long way from the frontier farmer's pot still, and the cultural mythology of bourbon as the authentic American spirit, democratic, unpretentious, made from corn by real people in Kentucky, coexisted interestingly with this more polished cocktail-era identity. The frontier origins and the Madison Avenue glass were, both part of the same story by then. In 1964, Congress formally designated bourbon whiskey as a distinct product of the United States, codifying the production standards that defined it and establishing that bourbon could not be produced outside the United States and still legally carry the bourbon designation. This was both a commercial protection and a cultural statement. It drew a legal perimeter around the product and said, in federal statute, this is what bourbon is. These are the standards, and no spirit produced elsewhere gets to use this name. The minimum 51% corn grain bill, the aging in new charred oak containers, the maximum distillation proof and barrel entry proof, all of it formally codified. The congressional designation was, in important respects, the culmination of a regulatory project that had been building since the Bottled-in Bond Act of 1897. International markets expanded through the 1960s and 70s. Japan, in particular, developed a sophisticated and enthusiastic consumer base for Kentucky bourbon. Export volumes grew steadily, and then came a sharp domestic contraction. Through the 1970s and 80s, American bourbon consumption fell significantly as vodka and lighter blended spirits took increasing market share. Many distilleries reduced production or closed entirely. Aged stocks accumulated in Kentucky warehouses while sales stagnated. Some historians refer to this period as the Dark Ages of bourbon. It was rough. Really rough. That contraction paradoxically created the conditions for what came next. The deeply aged bourbon sitting quietly in barrels through the slow decades became, when the market for premium spirits recovered in the 1990s and 2000s, the foundation of a premium revival unlike anything the industry had previously experienced. Limited releases, age-stated expressions, single-barrel bottlings, all of them built on whiskey that had been aging through the industry's worst years. The craft distilling renaissance that followed added breadth and diversity. Small independent distilleries appeared across every state, experimenting with heritage grains, alternative aging vessels, and localized production methods. The Kentucky Bourbon Trail, launched in 1999, turned the historical narrative itself into a commercial asset, drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors annually to hear the story. The Scots-Irish immigrants, the Whiskey Rebellion, the charred barrels, the federal green stamp, the medicinal loophole. The history of American whiskey became, in the most American way imaginable, a product. Export growth through the 2000s and 2010s brought American bourbon to record international volumes, a global market built on 2 centuries of production history, regulatory development, and brand investment. The same story that started with a chieftain dying from a surfeit of Aqua Vitae on Christmas Day in 1405 is now, somehow, a globally traded industry worth billions. But there's one thread of this history that the heritage marketing tends to soft-pedal. It's arguably the most important one, because it's about what this substance actually does to the human body, and about how long it took the medical establishment to be straight about the answer. The name Water of Life was not ironic. The monks of medieval Ireland and Scotland who produced the first distilled grain spirits were working within a medical framework that understood concentrated alcohol as a therapeutic substance, a vehicle for botanical medicine, a means of concentrating curative properties in portable form. This was not folk belief. It was formally endorsed medicine. In the early American Republic, around the time of the founding, alcohol was formally regarded as healthy by medically trained practitioners. Physicians endorsed the therapeutic properties of whiskey, wine, and beer in recognized medical literature. Whiskey was administered to treat malaria. It was used as a warming agent and a digestive aid. It was given to women as a sedative during labor. The cultural acceptance of moderate consumption and the medical endorsement of therapeutic use coexisted with a moral condemnation of habitual drunkenness, understood in this period not as a medical condition, but as a sin. The substance itself was not the problem. The misuse of the substance was the problem. The first serious challenge to this consensus came from one of the most prominent physicians of the early Republic. Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signatory of the Declaration of Independence, published a pamphlet around 1784 titled An Inquiry into the Effects of Ardent Spirits upon the Human Body and Mind. Rush's central argument was foundational and, for its time, deeply unconventional. Habitual drunkenness was not merely a moral failing, it was a disease, a condition of the body and the will with identifiable progression, specific physiological consequences, and an observable trajectory that could be described, studied, and treated. Rush recommended cold water as an alternative. He was the first physician to formally frame pathological drinking as an illness rather than purely a sin. He was taken somewhat seriously and not quite seriously enough, which is, the usual fate of people who are right before their moment has arrived. The medical consensus shifted gradually across the 19th century, and here's where it gets interesting. The most decisive early evidence came from an entirely unsentimental direction. Life assurance companies, motivated by the most practical possible interest in accurate mortality data, documented elevated death rates among heavy drinkers in formal actuarial follow-up studies as early as 1851. The first systematic quantitative demonstration that excessive alcohol consumption was associated with premature mortality did not come from temperance campaigners or public health reformers. It came from insurance actuaries calculating risk. They had no moral agenda. They just needed to know who died when and from what. What they found was unambiguous. By the early 20th century, the trajectory had reached its institutional conclusion. In 1916, 3 years before the 18th Amendment was ratified, whiskey and brandy were formally removed from the list of scientifically approved medicines in the Pharmacopoeia of the United States of America. It was the medical profession acknowledging what its own evidence had established. The therapeutic case for whiskey, as medicine, could not survive scientific scrutiny. In 1917, the American Medical Association followed, voting to support Prohibition on the basis that alcohol had no recognized therapeutic value. This removal also had a real political consequence. It eliminated the most significant institutional medical argument for the continued legal availability of distilled spirits, at precisely the moment when the constitutional push for prohibition was reaching its legislative climax. One of the major pillars supporting whiskey's legal status quietly came down, and only 3 years later, the 18th Amendment passed. The 20th century brought increasingly systematic investigation. The specific diseases associated with chronic, heavy alcohol consumption were progressively identified and documented with growing precision. Liver cirrhosis, pancreatitis, multiple cancers, cardiovascular disease, neurological damage, fetal developmental abnormality. The American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, in its third edition of 1980, formally defined alcohol dependence as a recognized medical condition with specific, reproducible diagnostic criteria. The culmination of the intellectual trajectory Rush had initiated nearly 2 centuries earlier, now expressed in clinical language. The arc from 1405, a chieftain dying from Aqua Vitae in an Irish chronicle at Christmas, to the 2023 WHO statement spans more than 6 centuries. The monks who called it the water of life were not wrong about its economic utility, its agricultural logic, its cultural centrality across centuries of production, or the comfort it provided people living hard lives in difficult conditions. They just lacked the analytical tools to understand what it was doing to the bodies of the people consuming it. The progressive accumulation of those tools, from Rush's pamphlet to insurance actuaries to epidemiological studies to Group 1 carcinogen classification, is the medical history of American whiskey. And it runs alongside the agricultural history and the political history and the regulatory history and the cultural history, inseparable from all of them. That convergence is what makes the title accurate. The most dangerous drink in American history is not dangerous in one way. It's dangerous in all the ways history makes things dangerous. Economically, politically, chemically, constitutionally. The frontier farmer distilling rye to avoid bankruptcy. The Kentucky distiller aging corn in charred oak for a national market. The federal inspector tarred and feathered in western Pennsylvania. The Treasury Secretary who sent nearly 13,000 soldiers after a few hundred rebels. The physician writing prescriptions during Prohibition for conditions whiskey was not medically treating. The WHO scientist classifying it alongside tobacco. They're all characters in the same story. And the story is not tidy, and it is not finished.